She was in labor when she realized the doctor was her ex, and his next move left everyone speechless. Help me reach 40K subscribers. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks. The Chicago midnight on a Thursday in November was a blur of lights and silence for most of its residents, but for Laura Bennett it was an epicenter of pain and noise. The sharp metallic sound of the gurney's wheels tore through the sterile quiet of the hallways at Mercy General Hospital, a rhythm that seemed synced with the waves of contractions ripping her apart. Each spasm was a hot blade, a brutal reminder that the life she carried was eager to break free from its cocoon. But the physical pain, overwhelming as it was just a distant echo of the true agony consuming her, an abyss of loneliness carved into her chest. She was about to give birth, and she was utterly alone. Sweat streamed down her forehead, mixing with the silent tears she tried to swallow. Tears that weren't just from the labor pain, but from 6 months of a nameless grief. The mourning for a future turned to dust. 6 months. It felt like a lifetime. 6 months ago, Laura's world was a vibrant canvas, painted with the colors of love and promise. She and Daniel Hayes weren't just a couple, they were a phenomenon. She, a rising marketing executive whose mind bubbled with brilliant campaigns and slogans that stuck in the soul. He, an obstetrician who seemed born with the gift of calm, a doctor whose reputation for excellence was whispered with reverence in Chicago's medical circles. Together, they lived in a sunny apartment in the heart of Lincoln Park, a sanctuary where the scent of fresh coffee mingled with plans for a future together. They talked about opening a clinic, a space that would blend his science with her communication skills, a life project. They traveled, dreamed, lived one of those love stories that seemed scripted, too perfect to be real. And maybe they were. The crack appeared on the happiest day of Laura's life. With the pregnancy test in hand, the 2 pink lines glowing like a beacon of joy, she waited for him. When Daniel arrived, the exhaustion from his shift fading as he saw her smile that way, she showed him the small piece of plastic that would redefine their universe. But the reaction she expected, a hug, a shout of joy, tears of emotion, never came. What came was a heavy, dense silence that sucked all the air from the room. The sparkle in Daniel's eyes, the one she loved so much, went out like a candle blown by a cold wind. "Not now, Laura," he said, his voice a trembling thread, almost inaudible. The phrase hung in the air, loaded with a denial that hurt her more than any insult. "Not now? What do you mean, not now?" she asked, her smile dying on her lips. "What are you afraid of, Daniel?" He looked away, unable to face her, and the response that came was a whisper that sealed their fate. Of everything. From that moment, their love began to die. It wasn't a noisy death, with fights and slamming doors. It was a silent death, a slow and painful asphyxiation. Daniel wasn't a jerk in the classic sense. He didn't abandon her financially. The alimony was deposited with cold, impersonal punctuality, ensuring she and the baby had everything they needed. But he vanished. The man who shared her bed, dreams and soul became a ghost, a bank transfer, a name in a memory she desperately tried to erase. He never called to check on her, never asked about the baby's development, never touched her belly. He simply withdrew from the equation, leaving a void that Laura had to fill with her own strength. The cheerful, lively marketing exec gave way to a warrior, a solitary warrior who learned to assemble the crib alone, who went to prenatal appointments with no one to hold her hand, who prepared to be the entire world for a child who was already fiercely loved, even before being born. And now here she was, on the threshold of the most transformative moment of her life, being wheeled by nurses who saw just another patient. The gurney stopped in front of a pair of automatic doors that opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing the cold, blinding light of the obstetric center. The smell of antiseptic invaded her nostrils, and a male voice, calm and professional, sounded from inside the room. "Bring her in. The team is ready." Laura squinted, trying to adjust to the brightness, and when she finally focused, her world stopped spinning. Time froze. The air escaped her lungs in a mute gasp. There, standing beside the delivery table, adjusting his surgical mask, was him. The dark hair, the confident posture, the broad shoulders under the white coat. And on the fabric, embroidered in a sober blue and professional, a name that was both a prayer and a curse. Dr. Daniel Hayes, Gynecology and Obstetrics. The universe, in its cruelest and most exquisite irony, had decided that the man who abandoned her out of fear of being a father would be the one to bring their child into the world. The impossible reunion was happening, not in a coffee shop or some random street corner in the city, but here in the most vulnerable and sacred place imaginable. The name embroidered on his coat was a punch to Laura's stomach, a blow that left her breathless and made the pain of the latest contraction seem insignificant. Dr. Daniel Hayes. The blue letters, perfectly aligned, were an affront, a mockery of fate. For an instant, the world narrowed to that name and the face she knew better than her own. His eyes, which for a second were scanning a chart, lifted and met hers. The shock was mutual, an electric current of disbelief that paralyzed them both. Daniel's professional mask, the composure of an experienced doctor, cracked and shattered in a millisecond. He saw not a patient, but Laura, his Laura. And she saw not a doctor, but the ghost of her great love, the architect of her deepest pain, materialized in the worst place at the worst imaginable moment. A guttural, desperate no escaped her lips, a sound more animal than human. Not him. Anyone but him. The nurse beside her, an older woman with graying hair and a tired but kind gaze, looked from one to the other, confusion stamped on her face. She couldn't comprehend the dimension of the tragedy unfolding in that room. To her, it was just a doctor and a patient. To them, it was the collision of two universes. To understand the magnitude of that reunion, one had to go back in time, to a world that now seemed to belong to another life, to other people. Daniel and Laura weren't a couple that just happened. They were a construction, a symphony of compatibilities that made everyone around them sigh. They met at a charity event at Mercy General Hospital itself. Laura, representing the marketing firm where she worked, was there to pitch a pro bono campaign for the pediatric wing. She spoke with contagious passion, her gestures broad, her voice clear and full of conviction, turning data and strategies into an emotional narrative about hope. Daniel, leaning against the back of the auditorium, was supposed to be there for just 5 minutes out of pure obligation, but stayed until the end. He, a man of science, logic, concrete facts, was completely hypnotized by this woman who seemed to sell dreams with the same ease he read an ultrasound. He who lived in a world of protocols and procedures was fascinated by how she organized the chaos of creativity into something beautiful and functional. At the end of the presentation, he approached her, not with a cheap pickup line, but with a question about the campaign. The conversation flowed from work to life, from the hospital to the hidden bars in Wicker Park, from professional dreams to personal vulnerabilities. They discovered they were complementary in an almost scary way. She was the explosion of colors. He, the blank canvas that gave them meaning. She was the storm of ideas. He, the safe harbor that helped her anchor the best ones. The dating kicked off with the naturalness of a reunion, not a first meeting. In less than a year, they were living together in that apartment in Lincoln Park that became the headquarters of their plans. Sunday mornings were sacred, the smell of coffee brewed by him mixed with the sound of her keyboard. As Laura sketched ideas on her laptop and Daniel read scientific articles, sharing a comfortable silence that only deeply connected souls can enjoy. They were the embodiment of success and happiness. Laura, with her innate talent for communication, was on the verge of becoming a partner at the firm. Her campaigns won awards, and her ability to understand the consumer psyche was almost witchcraft. Daniel, in turn, wasn't just a good doctor. He was one of the best. His calm in high-risk deliveries was legendary. Patients adored him, not just for his technical competence, but for his empathy. The way he turned a scary medical event into a human and welcoming experience. He had hands of an angel and the patience of a monk. The joint clinic plan was the next logical step. Hayes and Bennett Clinic, they joked, health and communication for the modern woman. It would be an integrated center with top-notch obstetric care, psychological support, image consulting for expectant mothers, everything. Laura had already designed the logo, the color palette, the brand's tone of voice. Daniel had listed the state-of-the-art equipment he wanted to import. They weren't just building a career or a relationship, they were building an empire together, a legacy. And then came the test. Those two pink lines that should have been the golden brick in their empire's foundation, but turned out to be a sledgehammer. Daniel's reaction wasn't just fear, it was visceral terror, a darkness that overtook his features and turned him into a stranger. Of everything, he said, and in that everything, Laura felt included. His career, the meticulous plans, the order he so prized. She tried to argue, to understand. Daniel, a child doesn't destroy, a child builds. We'll figure it out. We always do. But she was talking to a wall. The rational man, the pillar of calm, had disintegrated, giving way to a fragile, scared figure she didn't recognize. The conversation that followed was the most painful of her life. He didn't yell. He didn't blame her. Worse, he shut down. He spoke in vague terms about pressure, responsibility, and not being ready, clichés that sounded empty and cruel coming from the man who, until then, shared his most intimate thoughts with her. The separation was a surgical process, executed with the cold precision he applied in his profession. He suggested she keep the apartment, but Laura refused. It was impossible for her to continue living at the scene of the crime, the place where her heart had been broken. She stayed with her parents in the suburbs for a while, a forced retreat to lick her wounds, before renting a small apartment for herself in Chicago, closer to work and the hospital she'd chosen for prenatal care. Daniel, true to his methodical nature, handled the financial part without her needing to ask. He hired a lawyer to formalize a generous alimony that covered rent, health insurance, and all future baby expenses. To the outside world, it seemed noble. At least he's responsible, some friends said. But for Laura, that responsibility without affection was torture. Each deposit into her account was a reminder that, to him, the child was an obligation to fulfill, not a joy to share. It was the price he paid to keep his conscience clean, to sleep at night in his empty bed, free from the problem she represented. As her belly grew, Laura rebuilt herself, piece by piece. She dove into work with a ferocity that scared her colleagues, but yielded her best results ever. She became her own rock. She attended childbirth classes surrounded by couples exchanging loving glances, felt the sting of envy, but swallowed it and focused on breathing. She set up the baby's room, painting the walls a soft blue, choosing every detail with overflowing love. She talked to her son every night, telling him about her day, singing to him, promising him he'd never lack for anything, that her love would be enough for 2, for 3, for 1,000. The vibrant, dreamy woman didn't die. She just became stronger, more focused, a lioness preparing her den. She convinced herself she was better off this way, that she didn't need a man who saw her as an obstacle. She became a fortress. But every fortress has a weak point, and Laura's, at that moment, was the man standing a few feet away, dressed as her savior and her executioner. Reality hit her with the force of a train. "Get him out of here!" she screamed, her voice torn by pain and panic, pointing a trembling finger in Daniel's direction. "I don't want this man near me. Call another doctor, anyone." Chaos ensued. The head nurse, alerted by the shouts, entered the room, trying to understand the situation. Daniel remained motionless, pale under the white light, his eyes fixed on Laura's, a storm of indecipherable emotions passing through them. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? That it was a terrible coincidence. That Dr. Ramirez, who was supposed to be on shift, had a last-minute family emergency and he was called to cover. That he had no idea the patient in advanced labor was her. No excuse seemed adequate. The truth was that fate, with its sadistic sense of humor, had cornered them. And as Laura was shaken by another contraction, stronger, longer, more brutal, a terrifying certainty began to form in her mind. There was nowhere to run. Their story, which she thought had ended, was about to have its most crucial chapter written right there in that room, under the gaze of the man she loved most and who hurt her most. Laura's scream echoed through the delivery room, a sound loaded with 6 months of repressed pain, and for an instant, everything stopped. The nurses exchanged glances. The anesthesiologist paused, preparing his equipment, and Daniel felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. That scream wasn't just from a panicked patient. It was a verdict, a condemnation. "Get him out of here!" The head nurse, a woman named Margaret, with the authority of 30 years of experience etched on her face, approached the gurney. "Miss Bennett, calm down. Dr. Hayes is the shift lead, one of our best obstetricians." The attempt at appeasement was like pouring gasoline on the fire. "I don't care if he's the president. I don't want him touching me. Call Dr. Ramirez, Dr. Patel, anyone." Laura's voice was a razor edge, sharp and dangerous. Margaret looked at Daniel, seeking an explanation, but he was lost, drowning in the sea of fury and hurt emanating from Laura's eyes. It was the younger nurse who intervened, whispering to the head, "Nurse Margaret, Dr. Ramirez is stuck in an appendectomy that complicated, and Dr. Patel went home with a high fever. We don't have another senior obstetrician available right now." The information fell like a death sentence in the room. There was no escape. Fate had locked them in there together. Daniel finally seemed to snap out of his paralysis. He swallowed hard, the sound audible in the tense silence, and took a step forward. It was a small movement but loaded with monumental weight. He removed his surgical mask, letting it hang around his neck, a protocol violation that showed the urgency of the moment. He needed her to see his face, to see the truth in his eyes. "Laura," he began, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable. "Please." Another contraction hit her, a tsunami of pain that made her arch her back and dig her nails into the sheets. She screamed, a primal sound that silenced any other attempt at dialogue. When the wave passed, she was panting, sweat sticking her hair to her face, her eyes bloodshot with tears and rage. "Don't you dare say my name," she hissed, each word poison. "You lost that right a long time ago." Daniel took a deep breath, the air seeming to burn his lungs. He knew there was no logical argument, no excuse that could fix this. But he was also a doctor, and the doctor in him was seeing the danger signs. The time between contractions was decreasing dangerously, their intensity brutal. He glanced at the fetal heart monitor, and his blood ran cold. The rhythm, which should be steady, was starting to fluctuate worryingly. The professionalism, forged in hundreds of deliveries, took control. He turned to the team, his voice now firm in command. "Prep the IV with oxytocin on an infusion pump, but don't start yet. I want continuous monitoring. Margaret, keep an eye on her pressure." He turned back to Laura, and this time there was no hesitation in his gaze. There was only the urgency of a doctor fighting time. "Laura, listen to me. Forget who I am. Forget everything. Think only of the baby. The labor is becoming dysfunctional. I need to examine you now." The mention of the baby was the only thing that pierced her wall of hatred. Her eyes widened with a new kind of fear, the maternal fear that overrides all others. She looked at Daniel, the man who abandoned her, but also the renowned doctor, the specialist she would have trusted with her life if he were a complete stranger. The war inside her was visible on her face. Hatred versus protective instinct, hurt versus the need to save her child. She said nothing, but a sob escaped her lips, a sound of surrender. It was enough. Daniel took it as the reluctant permission he needed. He gloved up with a quick, trained motion, his hands, which once touched her with love and desire, now preparing to touch her with clinical distance. But when his fingers touched her, an uncontrollable tremor ran through his hand. He closed his eyes for a second, fighting to compose himself. That touch was a bridge to a past he'd tried to bury, a past now pulsing with life under his fingers. He performed the exam quickly, his expression growing grimmer by the second. "Dilation hasn't progressed. 7 centimeters for over 2 hours, he announced to the team, his voice tense. "The baby's high." He looked at the monitor again and his face paled. "Fetal bradycardia. The heart rate's dropping. Margaret, what's the frequency?" The nurse confirmed what he feared. "Down to 90 beats per minute, doctor." The alarm blared in the room, a shrill, insistent beep that was the soundtrack of disaster. Acute, fetal distress, the worst nightmare for any obstetrician. There was no more time for birth plans, discussions, the past. There was only a window of minutes to act before the unthinkable happened. Daniel ripped off his gloves. His decision was instantaneous, his voice slicing the air like a scalpel. "We can't wait. Emergency C-section." "Now, Margaret, alert the OR, tell them we're coming up in 2 minutes. Anesthesiologist, prep the spinal. I want this baby out in under 10 minutes. The room, previously paralyzed by emotional tension, exploded into frantic, coordinated activity. Instruments were readied, the gurney unlocked, and Laura felt the world spin. C-section, emergency, fetal distress. The words ricocheted in her mind, terrifying. She looked at Daniel, now the embodiment of calm in the hurricane, giving orders, moving with ruthless efficiency. He approached her as they wheeled her down the hall toward the operating room. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, and the world seemed to shrink until it was just them. "Laura, look at me," he said, his voice low but intense, forcing her to focus. "I know you hate me. You have every right, but right now none of that matters. I swear on my life, on my profession, I won't let anything happen to you, and I won't let anything happen to our son." The word echoed in her brain, more potent than any anesthetic. "Ah." A whisper escaped her lips, soaked in tears and irony so bitter it burned her throat. "Now he's our?" Daniel didn't respond. The pain in his eyes was the only answer he could give before stepping away to begin surgical prep. In the operating room, everything was cold, metallic, and green. Laura felt the sting of the anesthesia in her back, the warmth spreading through her legs, the loss of sensation that was both relief and terror. A blue surgical drape was raised, blocking her view, isolating her in her own world of fear and anticipation. She could only hear the sounds, the click of instruments, the calm, focused voices of the team, and the sound of her own heart pounding wildly. And then she heard Daniel's voice, close to her ear. He was there beside her head while another surgeon assisted. "I'm here, Laura. I'm not leaving your side." The minutes that followed were an eternity. She felt the pressure, the movement in her abdomen, but not the pain. And then, a sound that changed everything. A cry. Weak at first, then gaining strength, a sharp, powerful wail full of life that tore through the sterile silence of the operating room. It was the most beautiful sound Laura had ever heard. It was the sound of a miracle. Tears of relief, exhaustion, pure joy streamed freely down her face. From the other side of the drape, she heard a choked sob. And then, Daniel appeared beside her, his face wet with sweat and tears, holding a small bundle of blue blankets. He held the baby in his arms with an almost painful reverence, as if holding the most fragile and precious thing in the universe. He brought him close to Laura's face. The baby was small, wrinkled, perfect. And his eyes, when they opened for an instant, were two small onyx stones, dark and deep, identical to Daniel's. "It's a boy, Laura," Daniel said, his voice choked, broken by emotion. "A beautiful, perfect boy." Laura extended her hand, trembling, and touched her son's soft cheek. The entire world narrowed to that touch. All the abandonment, all the pain, all the loneliness of the past months dissolved, replaced by a wave of love so overwhelming it left her breathless. She looked at the baby, then at Daniel, and with the clearest, firmest voice she could muster, she named her miracle, her future. "His name," she said, "is Alexander." The days following Alexander's birth were a surreal blur. Laura was settled in a private room at Mercy General, a privilege she knew Daniel had arranged, but didn't have the strength to refuse. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of that room, and her universe revolved around a tiny 3-pound being who smelled of milk and promise. Alexander was a calm baby who slept and nursed with a serenity that belied the turbulence of his arrival. Laura spent hours just gazing at him, memorizing every detail. The tufts of dark, fine hair, the small mouth that moved in sleep, the tiny hands that gripped her finger with surprising strength. That pure, unconditional love was the balm healing her soul's wounds. He was living proof that she had won. Daniel was a ghostly presence in those first days. He didn't enter the room as a father, but as a doctor. He stopped by during the official team rounds, keeping a professional distance, asking about her recovery, breastfeeding, the baby, always referring to Alexander as the newborn or the patient. His voice was neutral, his gaze impenetrable. He was Dr. Hayes, the competent obstetrician, and nothing more. But Laura saw him. She saw the cracks in his armor. She saw how his eyes lingered on the bassinet a second longer than professionally necessary. She saw the tension in his jaw when Alexander made a small sound. She saw the hunger in his gaze, the hunger of a father forbidding himself to touch his own son. He fulfilled his role with iron discipline, but it was a performance. And Laura, who knew him so well, could see the man behind the mask unraveling. On the third night, Laura's fortress, rebuilt with love for her son, felt solid enough to demand answers. The wound of abandonment was still there, throbbing beneath the surface of maternal happiness. She needed to understand. Not to forgive him, maybe not even for herself, but so her son's story wouldn't start with a question mark. She needed the ghost haunting the hallways of her life to take shape, voice, and above all, a reason. When the night nurse finished checking her vitals and took Alexander to the nursery so she could rest a bit, Laura pressed the call button. "I need to speak with Dr. Hayes," she said to the voice on the other end, her own voice sounding firmer than she felt. "It's urgent." 20 minutes later, he knocked on the door, not as the head doctor on rounds, but hesitant, almost shy. He wasn't wearing his coat, just a wrinkled dress shirt, the top buttons open, revealing the exhaustion of an endless shift. He looked younger, more vulnerable. "Is something wrong?" "Are you okay?" "Alexander," he began, genuine concern breaking his professional facade. "We're fine," she cut him off, her voice calm but loaded with an intensity that made him stop in the middle of the room. "Sit down, Daniel. We need to talk." He hesitated, looking at the armchair beside the bed as if it were an electric chair. But he sat. The silence that settled was heavy, filled with everything unsaid in the last 6 months. Laura observed him, the man she loved with every fiber of her being, and the question burning in her soul finally surfaced, not as a shout but as an almost whispered plea. "You need to tell me what made you change so much. Why did you leave me? I deserve to know. Our son deserves to know." The question hit him like a physical blow. He slumped his shoulders, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if the vinyl tile pattern held all the universe's answers. For a long moment, Laura thought he wouldn't respond, that he'd stand and leave, leaving her once again with silence. But then he took a deep breath, a trembling sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, and began to speak. His voice was hoarse, a lost murmur, the voice of a man confessing an old sin. "When I was 8 years old," he started, and Laura leaned forward, instinctively knowing what followed was the key to everything. "My mother got pregnant. I was going to have a sister. Her name would be Mia." He paused, swallowing hard, fighting the images invading his mind. Laura remained silent, giving him the space he needed to unearth his demons. "It was a high-risk pregnancy," he continued, his eyes still glued to the floor. "My mother started having swelling, leg pains, things that back then, almost 30 years ago, were treated as normal pregnancy discomforts. Today we know what it was. She had a genetic condition called thrombophilia, a predisposition to blood clots. In pregnancy, the risk skyrockets. The treatment is simple, relatively. Daily anticoagulant injections. But the diagnosis has to be made, and back then no one talked about it. It wasn't routine testing. My mother's diagnosis came too late." His voice cracked, and he rubbed his face with his hands, a gesture of pure exhaustion and pain. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. As a marketer, she knew the power of a story, and the story Daniel was telling was a Greek tragedy. "I remember the day of the birth like it was yesterday," he whispered. "I remember the rush, the worried faces. I remember hearing my grandmother crying on the phone. My sister Mia died during the delivery. A massive pulmonary embolism in my mother. The clot broke loose and went to her lung. There was no time. My sister died from lack of oxygen, and my mother died on the operating table, trying to bring her into the world." The shock of the revelation hit Laura hard. She brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror and overwhelming compassion. The image of Daniel, an 8-year-old boy losing his mother and sister on the same day, was devastating. But the most terrible part of the story was still to come. Daniel lifted his gaze for the first time, and his eyes were swimming in unshed tears. "My father," he said, his voice breaking, "was the obstetrician at the delivery." The air left Laura's lungs. The cruelty of that sentence was almost inconceivable. His father, the doctor, the husband, having to watch powerless the death of the woman he loved and the daughter he'd never know, all under his hands. "I grew up watching a man disintegrate," Daniel continued, his voice now a thread. "My father was never the same. He quit obstetrics, quit medicine for a while. He was an empty shell, a ghost in the house. Every time he looked at me, I saw the guilt in his eyes, the guilt for not saving them. He blamed himself every day, for every decision he made, for every sign he might have missed. He became a broken man, haunted by what if. I grew up in the shadow of that tragedy, that failure. And I swore to myself since I decided to be a doctor that I'd be different. That I'd be the best, that I'd control every variable, that I'd never ever put a woman, a family in the same position my father was in. Now it all made sense. The obsession with perfection, the supernatural calm under pressure, the choice of obstetrics, a desperate attempt to rewrite the past, to fix what his father couldn't. And the fear, the paralyzing fear. "When you showed me that test, Laura," he said, and now the tears streamed freely down his face, silent and devastating. "When I saw those 2 lines, I didn't see a future. I didn't see a family. I saw my mother. I saw my father's face. I saw myself in the delivery room, and the only thing I could feel was absolute terror, a fear that history would repeat itself. The fear of losing you, of losing our child, was so great, so overwhelming that I panicked. I became that 8-year-old boy again, terrified and powerless." He looked at her, his gaze pleading, desperate for understanding. "So I did the only thing my terrified brain could think of. I ran. I distanced myself. I thought if I didn't get involved, if I kept my distance, if I didn't love the baby like I already loved you, maybe it wouldn't hurt as much if the worst happened." He shook his head, a bitter, self-destructive smile on his lips. "What an idiot. What a coward. By trying to avoid pain, I caused a pain 1,000 times worse. In you. In me. I abandoned you when you needed me most. And there hasn't been a single day, a single hour in the last 6 months that I haven't hated myself for it." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. And in the silence of that hospital room, Laura finally understood. It wasn't lack of love, it was too much love distorted by a deep, unresolved trauma. It was the fear of loving so much that he couldn't survive the loss. The sound of Daniel's sobs filled the quiet room, a raw and unprotected sound that dismantled the last image Laura had of him as a cold, distant man. There, in the armchair, wasn't Dr. Hayes, the impeccable obstetrician, nor the ex-boyfriend who abandoned her. It was just Daniel, a man broken by an old pain, an 8-year-old boy trapped in an adult's body. Laura said nothing. There were no words that could reach the depth of that suffering. Instead, she did something that surprised even herself. She extended her hand, the same hand that hours earlier she wanted to use to slap him, and touched his shoulder. It was a light, hesitant touch, but it was enough. Under her touch, his sobs subsided, turning into trembling breaths. He didn't lift his head, but the presence of her hand there was an anchor, a point of contact with a present that wasn't just made of pain. The confession didn't erase the 6 months of loneliness. It didn't undo the nights Laura cried hugging her belly, nor the prenatal appointments where she felt like a question mark amid so many happy exclamation points. But the confession gave her pain context. It turned the malice she imagined into a tragic weakness. It wasn't about her. It never was about her. It was about Mia. It was about a destroyed father and a son who grew up fearing his own shadow of love. The rage that fueled her for so long began to dissipate, not replaced by forgiveness. It was too soon for that, but by a complex, painful understanding. She now saw not a monster, but a man so terrified of history repeating that he preferred to tear out the pages before the tragic end could be written. In the following days, a new dynamic, fragile and uncertain, established itself between them. Daniel continued his visits, but the professional mask had vanished. He entered the room silently, asked how she and Alexander were, and his eyes sought the small bassinet with a mix of reverence and fear. Laura, in turn, allowed this cautious approach. One day, while she held Alexander, who slept on her chest, Daniel stood near the door just watching. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked, her voice low. He stepped back, as if the offer burned him. "I don't know if I can," he whispered. "What if I—" He didn't finish the sentence. "He's not made of glass, Daniel," Laura said with a gentleness that disarmed him. "He's strong like his mother." She stood, and with courage she didn't know she had, placed little Alexander in his father's arms for the first time. Daniel went rigid, his arms awkward, panic stamped on his face. But then Alexander stirred, nestling into his chest, and something in Daniel broke. A solitary tear rolled down his face and dripped onto the baby's blanket. In that moment, he wasn't a doctor, wasn't a haunted man. He was just a father holding his son. 2 weeks later, Laura was already home in her small and cozy apartment, fully immersed in the chaotic and wonderful routine of a new mother. Life had found a new rhythm, made of feedings, diaper changes, and long sleepless nights. Daniel called every day. The conversations were short, focused on Alexander. Did he sleep well? Did the fever go down? Do you need anything? They were questions from a father trying to find his place, one step at a time. Laura answered with contained honesty, keeping a safe distance. She was still processing everything. The wound was too deep to be healed with a few talks and a silent apology. It was on a rainy Saturday afternoon that everything changed. The doorbell rang and Laura, expecting the pharmacy delivery, opened the door and found Daniel standing in the hallway. He wasn't in doctor clothes, but jeans and a simple t-shirt. In his hands he carried no flowers or baby gifts. He had a laptop and a folder full of papers. There was a new light in his eyes, an intensity Laura hadn't seen since the days they planned the clinic together. "Can I come in?" he asked. "I need to show you something." Intrigued, she stepped aside. He set up the laptop on the living room table, amid bottles and toys, and opened the folder. "Since Alexander's birth, since our talk, I can't stop thinking," he began, his voice vibrating with nervous energy. "I've spent the last 2 weeks researching, talking to geneticists, hematologists, psychologists, and I realized something terrible, Laura. My mother's story. It keeps happening. Every day." He turned the laptop to her. On the screen were graphs, statistics, scientific articles. Thrombophilia affects up to 15% of the population. During pregnancy, it's one of the main causes of recurrent miscarriages, preeclampsia, premature births, and in the worst cases, maternal and fetal death. And the cruelest part is that most women only find out after 1, 2, 3 losses. The diagnosis is made through pain, not prevention. That's unacceptable. It's a gigantic system failure. He spoke with the passion of an activist, the precision of a scientist, and the pain of a son who lost his mother. "I want to create something to change that," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "Something to help women avoid what my mother went through. Something to turn her story and mine into a warning, a tool for salvation." Laura listened, fascinated. The man who fled the past now wanted to face it head-on and fight it. "How so?" she asked, her heart beating faster. "A project," he said, the word loaded with purpose. "A total awareness project on thrombophilia and other high-risk conditions in pregnancy. I want to create a platform with clear, accessible information, no medical jargon. I want partnerships with labs to offer preventive tests at affordable prices, or even free for those who can't pay. I want to build a psychological support network for women who've suffered losses. I want to train doctors, nurses, so they think about thrombophilia before tragedy strikes." He took a deep breath, and then came the final blow, the phrase that gave soul to the whole project. "And I want it to bear my sister's name, the sister I never knew." He looked at the crib where Alexander slept. "I want it to be called Project Mia Alive. Mia Alive." The name echoed in the room, beautiful and painful. Laura felt a shiver. It was redemption. It was transforming guilt into legacy. She stayed silent for a few seconds, absorbing the magnitude of the idea. It was ambitious, powerful, necessary, And it was just like Daniel, the Daniel she loved, the man who used his intelligence and passion to care for others. "It's an incredible idea, Daniel," she said sincerely. He nodded, but his gaze was intense. "But that's not why I'm here. An idea is nothing without execution. And I can't do this alone." He leaned forward, urgency in his voice. "And where do I fit in?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "You're the heart of it, Laura," he said without hesitation. "I'm the doctor. I have the technical knowledge. But you're the communicator. You know how to turn information into emotion. You know how to make people listen. I want you to handle all the communication part. The website, social media, campaigns. I want you to create videos that make women cry, but also make them act. I want you to write texts that explain what Factor V Leiden is, in a way my grandmother would understand. I need you to give voice to Mia, so her story and so many others isn't in vain. I need you to help me make women know that lives can be saved with information." The proposal hung in the air. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an attempt to win her back. It was a call, an invitation to build something bigger than their pain. Laura looked at him, then at her son sleeping in the crib. Alexander, Mia, lives lost and lives saved, past and future, pain and hope, all connected. A slow smile, the first genuine smile she'd given in months in his presence, formed on her lips. "Then let's save lives together," she replied. And so, in the small living room of an apartment in Lincoln Park, the Project Mia Alive was born. Laura dove into the work with the same ferocity she'd used to rebuild herself. She turned the dining table into her office, working through the nights between feedings. She created a visual identity for the project that was both delicate and strong. She launched an Instagram profile that, instead of scary medical photos, featured emotional testimonials, clear infographics and live sessions with experts, always with Daniel by her side, translating med speak into plain English. The launch campaign, created by her, was a masterpiece of sensitivity. The main video didn't show doctors or hospitals. It showed an empty crib, a pair of booties that would never be worn, and the phrase, "Some stories don't need to end before they begin. Investigate thrombophilia. Just Mia Alive." The video went viral. In 48 hours, it had millions of views. Mums, doctors, influencers, everyone started sharing. The project's inbox exploded with women sharing stories of losses, late diagnoses, fear. Project Mia Alive had touched an open wound in society. In a few months, what started as an idea on a living room table became a national movement, a growing network of hope, saving lives and rewriting stories that were once doomed to tragedy. 1 year, 365 days. The time it takes for Earth to orbit the Sun, and the time it took for Laura and Daniel's life to circle back on itself. The auditorium at Mercy General Hospital, the same place where Laura once pitched a campaign and met the man who would change her life, was unrecognizable. Packed. People sitting on the stairs, standing in the aisles. They weren't just doctors and administrators. They were moms with babies in arms, couples holding hands, women with eyes shining with gratitude. They were the face and soul of Project Mia Alive. On the stage, a giant screen displayed the project's logo, a delicate butterfly, with one wing formed by the silhouette of a pregnant woman. It was a night of celebration, the first anniversary of a project that had become a phenomenon. Laura was in the front row, her heart beating to the rhythm of the applause. In her lap, Alexander, now a 1-year-old boy, curious and full of life, clapped clumsily, imitating the crowd. He wore a little plaid shirt and had the same dark, deep eyes as his father, but the easy smile and tireless curiosity were all hers. Beside her, Daniel watched everything with a humility that made him even greater. They were no longer just Laura and Daniel. They were a team. In the last 12 months, they had built much more than a project. They had built a bridge over the abyss that separated them. A bridge made of work, shared purpose, sleepless nights revising campaigns, and conversations that gradually went beyond Alexander and the project. They talked about fears, dreams, the past. They didn't try to fix what broke. Instead, they gathered the shards, and with the gold of experience and pain created something new, stronger, and infinitely more true. On the screen, a video began to play. It was a montage of testimonials, Laura's masterpiece for that night. The first woman who appeared, a young one named Jessica, held a smiling baby. "I had 3 miscarriages," she said, her voice choked. 3. The doctor said it was bad luck. It was a post from Mia Alive that made me seek a specialist. I found out about thrombophilia. Today, my bad luck is named Lucas. The camera focused on the baby in her arms, and the auditorium erupted in applause and tears. Other faces followed. A woman who discovered the condition before even getting pregnant. A husband thanking them for not losing his wife. A doctor from a small town in the Midwest, telling how the project's protocol helped him save a patient. And then, the last testimonial. A woman in her 40s, her face marked by life, but with a serene gaze. "My name is Claudia, and if it weren't for Project Mia Alive, I wouldn't be here to raise my son." The camera pulled back, revealing an 8-year-old boy beside her. "I had a pulmonary embolism in the 7th month. But my doctor, who had seen a lecture by Dr. Daniel, acted fast. He saved us both." She looked at the camera, seeming to look directly at Daniel. "Thank you for giving your mother a second chance through me." The silence that followed was more powerful than any applause. Daniel, who was standing ready to go on stage, froze. Those words hit him like lightning. A second chance for his mother. He brought his hand to his chest, the air missing from his lungs. Laura stood and touched his arm. Their eyes met, and she saw the pain, the catharsis, and the liberation all in one gaze. He was finally forgiving himself. The applause that followed was a sonic wave, a standing ovation that seemed endless. Daniel went up on stage, but not to the podium. He took the microphone and walked to the edge of the stage, closer to the people. "Good evening," he began, his voice choked. I didn't prepare a speech, because Mia Alive isn't about speeches. It's about stories. It's about Jessica, Claudia, and hundreds of others. But none of these stories would be possible without the person who gave this project its soul." He turned and extended his hand to Laura. "Laura, please come up here." Hesitant, she handed Alexander to a friend in the front row and went up on stage, her heart in her throat. Daniel applauded her, and the entire auditorium joined. "When I had the idea for this project," he continued, looking at her, "I was broken. I was a man haunted by guilt and fear. And it was this woman who taught me that the only way to beat a ghost isn't by running from it, but by turning it into light. None of this would have happened without her. She didn't just turn pain into hope. She taught me to turn guilt into love." Laura, her eyes full of tears, took the microphone he offered. "Thank you," she whispered to the crowd. But Daniel is being modest. He was the engine, the science, and the courage behind it all. He turned the greatest pain of his life into the greatest mission of his life. And he gave us a purpose. She looked at him, and in that moment, there was no one else in the auditorium. It was just them, on the stage of their lives, under the spotlights of their rewritten story. The look they exchanged said everything. It wasn't just forgiveness. It was admiration. It was partnership. It was a restart already in full swing. Later that night, after the hugs, photos, and promises of project expansion, they walked through the silent hospital hallway. The same hallway that, a year ago, had been the scene of the impossible reunion. Alexander slept deeply in Daniel's arms, his head nestled on his shoulder. The cycle was complete. The place of pain was now the place of celebration. As they reached the exit, the cool breeze of the Chicago night enveloped them. Daniel stopped and turned to Laura. He adjusted his sleeping son in one arm and, with his free hand, did what he'd longed to do for months. He held her hand, their fingers intertwined with a naturalness they both thought they'd lost forever. "Can I take you home?" he asked, his voice low, the question loaded with much greater meaning. Laura looked at their joined hands, then at his face, illuminated by the soft light of the street lamp. A smile, the smile he loved so much, the smile he thought he'd never see directed at him again, lit up her face. "To our home," she replied. And so, under the starry Chicago sky, they walked together toward the car. not as a couple trying to rekindle an old love, but as two people who had found amid the rubble of their lives the foundation to build something new. Their story sealed not with the feverish passion of the beginning, but with the serene strength of mutual respect, shared purpose, and the miracle of a life that united them in the most tortuous and perfect way possible. Their story was no longer about an end, but about a rebirth. A story of love, yes, but also a story of healing, legacy, and above all, life. So what did you think of this journey? Did this story touch you? On a scale of 0 to 10, what score would you give this story? Your opinion is our greatest gift. Now, to help us out, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks, and see you next time.